Randall Holt had always been the kind of man who preferred to keep to himself. At 42, he had built a quiet, stable life running his own small but reputable auto repair shop. He didn't care for drama, didn't meddle in neighborhood disputes, and certainly didn't make it a habit to engage with people who had a knack for causing trouble. His approach to life was simple: do good work, stay out of unnecessary conflicts, and keep personal matters as far away from business as possible. But as he was about to learn, some people refused to respect boundaries, and no amount of common sense could prepare him for the relentless, entitled storm that was Karen Bishop. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for years, and during that time, she had built quite the reputation. If there was a complaint to be made, a demand to be issued, or a grievance to be voiced, Karen was always at the center of it. From harassing the garbage collectors for picking up her trash too early to calling the city over minor sidewalk cracks, she thrived on confrontation. She wasn't just nosy, she was manipulative, overbearing, and utterly convinced that the world owed her something. And unfortunately for Randall, he had just become her latest target. It started on a Monday afternoon, just as Randall was closing up shop for the day. The smell of motor oil and grease clung to the air as he locked the tool cabinet and wiped his hands on an old rag. Business had been steady, and he was looking forward to an evening with his dog, a cold beer, and an old movie. But just as he was about to turn off the lights, the shop door swung open, and in walked Karen. Dressed in her usual pastel cardigan and oversized sunglasses perched atop her perfectly styled blonde bob, she carried herself with the kind of smug confidence that immediately put Randall on edge. "Hey there, Randy," she said, leaning against the counter like they were old friends. Randall, who had never once invited Karen to call him by anything other than his full name, forced a polite nod. "Karen, shop's closing up. What can I do for you?" She waved a dismissive hand as if his schedule was irrelevant. "Oh, I won't take much of your time. Just a quick little chat." She smiled, but there was something calculated about it. "I noticed you've got a few cars here that you're fixing up. Figured I'd come by and do you a favor." Randall raised an eyebrow. "A favor?" "Yeah," she continued, tilting her head as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You need a new car. And I thought since you're such a generous guy you could sell me one of these for a neighborly price. Cut me a deal." Randall exhaled slowly, already regretting this conversation. "Karen, all my cars are either waiting to be picked up by their owners or already spoken for. I don't have anything for sale at the moment." Karen's expression faltered for a split second before she plastered on another overly sweet smile. "Oh, come on now. You and I both know these cars don't belong to anyone yet. And even if they do, I'm sure you can make an exception. I mean, I see the kind of people you sell to. Some young guy with a hoodie and tattoos gets a car, but your neighbor can't?" Randall's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to entertain whatever nonsense she was implying. "It's not about exceptions. I run a business. I can't just sell cars off the books, and I certainly can't undercut the price for one person because they think they deserve it more." Karen scoffed, her smile now replaced with barely concealed irritation. "Oh, please. It's not like I'm asking for a free car. I'll pay you, just not whatever ridiculous price you usually charge. I mean, we're neighbors, Randall. Isn't community supposed to mean something?" Randall had had enough. "Karen, I appreciate the offer, but my answer is no. I don't have a car for you, and even if I did, I wouldn't be giving you a discount just because we live in the same neighborhood. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to close up." For a moment, Karen just stood there, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she shook her head. I thought you were different. A good neighbor. A decent man. Guess I was wrong." Randall didn't take the bait. He simply walked to the door and held it open, waiting for her to leave. With a final huff, Karen spun on her heel and stormed out. The moment she was gone, Randall locked up, shaking his head. He had a bad feeling about this, and he was right to be concerned. Over the next few days, Karen made her displeasure known in subtle but unmistakable ways. First, it was the passive-aggressive comments to other neighbors' little digs about how Randall only helps certain people and doesn't believe in supporting the community. Then came the thinly veiled threats, muttered just loud enough for him to hear. Must be nice running a business without worrying about permits. You know, I heard the city's been cracking down on small shops lately. Randall ignored her. He had all the necessary permits, and he wasn't about to let her get under his skin. But then, things started to escalate. One morning, he found deep scratches running along the side of his own truck. Later that evening, his security cameras picked up someone lurking near the back of his shop. The footage was grainy, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Karen was playing a dangerous game. Randall wasn't a man who spooked easily, but he knew better than to underestimate someone like her. Entitled people had a way of convincing themselves that they were the victims, no matter how wrong they were. And Karen? She had just begun. Randall had dealt with difficult customers before, but none had ever brought trouble straight to his front door the way Karen did. He had hoped that her little tantrum at the shop would be the end of it. But the way she had looked at him before leaving, the way her lips had curled ever so slightly into a smug little smirk, told him that she wasn't finished. He had dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the usual self-absorbed entitlement, but when things started going wrong one after another, it became clear that Karen was escalating. It started small. The first thing Randall noticed was that his mailbox had been tampered with. At first, he thought it was just a prank, maybe some kids messing around. But then he realized that certain letters were missing, specifically business-related ones. A few invoices from suppliers never arrived, and a renewal notice for one of his licenses was late. He double-checked with the post office, and they insisted everything had been delivered as usual, but when he checked his security camera, he saw a familiar figure loitering near his driveway the morning those letters were supposed to arrive. The footage wasn't perfectly clear, but there was no mistaking the shape of Karen's oversized sunglasses and the way she always carried her handbag as if it were a weapon. Randall gritted his teeth, knowing full well that confronting her outright wouldn't get him anywhere. She would deny everything, play the victim, and turn the whole neighborhood against him. So he took the smarter route. He filed a report with the Postal Service, mentioning possible mail theft, and set up another camera with a better angle. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of thinking she could mess with him unnoticed. Then came the property damage. At first it was minor, just a few scratches on the garage door that could have been anything. But then one morning he found the side mirror on his truck hanging loose, like someone had deliberately yanked on it. He knew it hadn't been an accident because there were fresh scuff marks on the paint, the kind that didn't happen from a careless driver brushing past. Someone had done this on purpose. Still, without direct proof, there wasn't much he could do. He just tightened the bolts, adjusted the mirror, and went about his business. But Karen wasn't satisfied with minor inconveniences. No, she wanted to push things further. One evening, just as Randall was finishing up in the shop, a customer walked in looking furious. The man, someone Randall had done work for in the past, slammed a printed-out email onto the counter and demanded an explanation. "Is this how you do business now?" he snapped. "Selling cars under the table and then changing your mind?" Randall blinked, confused. "I have no idea what you're talking about." The man shoved the email closer. "You sent me this. Said you were canceling our deal because you got a better offer." Randall picked up the paper and read it carefully. His stomach tightened. The email was formatted exactly like one of his own, complete with his shop's signature and contact information. But he hadn't written it. The message claimed that due to unexpected circumstances, the sale of a vehicle had been voided, and that Randall had chosen to sell it to someone else instead. He exhaled sharply, already suspecting who was behind this. "I never sent this," he said firmly. "That's not my email." The man narrowed his eyes. "So you're saying someone's impersonating you?" Randall nodded. "Looks like it." The customer was still angry, but now there was hesitation in his posture. Randall offered to pull up his email records, showing that no such message had been sent from his actual account. After a few minutes, the customer sighed and muttered something about crazy people with too much time on their hands before leaving, but the damage had been done. Someone was trying to sabotage his business, and he had a damn good idea of who it was. That night, Randall double-checked every security measure he had in place. He went through his emails, updated his passwords, and checked his business listings to make sure nothing had been tampered with. He even did a quick search on his name, wondering if any fake reviews had popped up, but so far, there was nothing. He didn't know what Karen's endgame was, but she was definitely laying the groundwork for something bigger. And then, as if to confirm his suspicions, she showed up again. It was early morning, just as Randall was unlocking the shop, when he heard her voice behind him. "Good morning, Randall." He turned slowly, already bracing himself. Karen stood there with her usual self-satisfied expression, holding a coffee cup in one hand like she had just stopped by for a friendly chat. "What do you want, Karen?" he asked flatly. She feigned a pout. "Is that any way to talk to a neighbor?" Randall wasn't in the mood for games. "I'm busy. Get to the point." She sighed dramatically. "Well, since you're being so direct, I'll cut to the chase. I still need a car, and I'm willing to be reasonable about it." "Reasonable," he repeated, his patience wearing thin. "Yes," she said cheerfully. "I know we got off on the wrong foot before, but I've been thinking, maybe we can come to an arrangement." He crossed his arms. "Not interested. You haven't even heard my offer yet." "I don't need to. I don't sell cars to people who harass me, damage my property, or try to ruin my business." Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Oh, Randall, that's quite the accusation. Are you sure you're not just being paranoid?" His jaw tightened. "I'm sure." Karen clicked her tongue and shook her head. "That's too bad. I really hoped we could work something out. I mean, I'd hate for you to have more inconveniences." And there it was, the thinly veiled threat. Randall exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "You know, Karen, if anything else happens to my property, I'll have no choice but to get law enforcement involved. I already have footage of someone messing with my shop, and I'm pretty sure they'll be interested in checking out any recent interactions I've had with you." For the first time, Karen looked slightly less confident. It was only for a second, but Randall caught it. She straightened her posture and let out a fake laugh. "Oh, Randall, you're such a joker. I'm just looking out for myself, that's all. A woman's got to do what she can to get by, right?" He didn't answer. He just stared at her until she finally took the hint and walked away. As she disappeared down the street, Randall knew one thing for certain: she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And sure enough, the very next day, something happened that took everything to an entirely different level. Randall had dealt with difficult customers before, but he had never encountered someone quite like Karen. She wasn't just persistent, she was calculating, and worst of all, she had absolutely no shame. He had given her a clear answer, had made it known that he wasn't interested in playing whatever game she was trying to pull him into, but Karen wasn't the type to accept rejection. She had made it her mission to get what she wanted, no matter what it took. And if she couldn't have it on her terms, she was more than happy to burn everything down around her in retaliation. Randall had expected her to retaliate in some way, but he hadn't expected her to be so bold about it. The first sign that things were about to get worse came when he arrived at the shop the next morning and found that someone had smashed one of the windows in the garage bay. At first, he thought it might have been a random act of vandalism, maybe some drunk teenagers or someone looking to cause trouble, but when he checked the security footage, his stomach twisted with anger. The video showed a figure, unmistakably Karen, walking up to the shop just after midnight. She lingered near the door for a moment, glancing up at the camera as if daring him to do something about it. Then, without hesitation, she picked up a brick from the ground and hurled it through the glass. Randall clenched his jaw as he replayed the footage, his anger boiling beneath the surface. She wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. This wasn't some passive-aggressive attempt to get under his skin. She was making it clear that she was willing to destroy his business if she couldn't get what she wanted. And worse, she knew exactly how to play the system. When Randall called the police, they took a report, but the moment he mentioned Karen's name, the officer sighed and rubbed his temple as if he had already heard this story before. "Yeah, we've had complaints about her before," the officer admitted, jotting down notes in his notepad. "She's got a history of causing problems, but she's good at keeping things just below the threshold of serious legal trouble. Never enough to get charged, always enough to be a major headache." Randall exhaled sharply. "So what am I supposed to do? Just let her get away with it?" The officer shook his head. "Not necessarily. If you press charges, she'll have to answer for it, but I'll be honest with you, people like her, they don't stop just because they get a slap on the wrist. If anything, it makes them double down." Randall didn't like that answer. He didn't like feeling like he had no control over the situation, like he was just waiting for Karen to escalate things even further. He didn't want to sit back and wait until she did something worse. He wanted to get ahead of it. But how? He boarded up the broken window and tried to go about his day as usual, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to spiral from here. And he was right. That evening, as he locked up and walked to his truck, he noticed something was off. The truck sat slightly lower than usual, and when he walked around to the passenger side, his suspicion was confirmed someone had slashed his tires. His hands curled into fists. Karen. He didn't need proof to know it was her. She had already vandalized his shop, of course she would come after his vehicle next. The worst part was that she was playing just smart enough to avoid getting caught red-handed. The cameras outside the shop were positioned mainly to capture the front entrance and the garage bay. The footage of the window being smashed had been a lucky break, but whoever had slashed the tires had done it just outside the camera's range. He had two choices: call the police again and get another report filed, or take matters into his own hands. And Randall wasn't the type to sit around waiting for someone else to handle his problems. Instead of replacing the tires right away, he decided to set a trap. He parked his truck in the same spot, left it exactly as it was, and spent the next few hours repositioning the cameras. He added two more, one covering the side of the building where his truck was parked, and another angled toward the street in case anyone tried to sneak around. He wasn't about to let Karen get away with this, and sure enough, his patience paid off. At around 2 in the morning, his phone buzzed with a notification from the security system. Someone was outside. He quickly pulled up the live feed, and there she was, Karen, crouching near his truck, a small knife in her hand as she inspected the damage she had already done, as if admiring her own handiwork. But then she did something that made Randall's stomach turn. She pulled out a can of spray paint. Before he could even process what he was seeing, she started defacing the side of his truck, scrawling something in big, messy letters. He could barely make out the words, but he didn't need to. The intent was clear. She wanted him to know this was personal. Randall didn't waste a second. He grabbed his keys, slipped out the back door of the shop, and moved quickly around the building, staying in the shadows. He wasn't going to confront her. He wasn't stupid, but he wanted to get close enough to catch her in the act. As he crept forward, the glow of his truck's security lights illuminated Karen's figure, her arms still moving as she finished her little message. And then she turned. For a split second, their eyes met. Karen's face twisted into a wicked grin, as if she had been expecting him all along. "Oh, Randall," she cooed, dropping the spray can with an exaggerated gasp. "You scared me." Randall kept his voice calm, controlled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, I was just passing by and saw that someone had already vandalized your truck. I thought I don't know, make sure you saw it?" Randall glanced at the damage. The words thief and scammer were smeared across the paint in dripping black spray. His blood boiled. "You think this is funny?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Karen laughed. "Oh, I think it's hilarious. You brought this on yourself, Randall. All you had to do was be a good neighbor. But no, you had to be selfish. And now, well, actions have consequences. Randall took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay composed. You know I have cameras, right? Karen's smirk faltered, but only for a second. Then she shrugged. So what? You think the cops are going to do anything? Vandalism's just a misdemeanor, Randall. Maybe a fine, maybe some community service, but guess what? I've got a damn good lawyer, and I know how to play the game. You're just a mechanic. She wasn't bluffing. And that's what made it so infuriating. Randall didn't say another word. He just pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of her standing next to the truck, the spray can still on the ground. Karen's smile finally faded. Oh, you think that's going to scare me? Randall let the silence hang between them for a moment before he turned on his heel and walked back toward the shop. We'll see. As he locked the door behind him, he could still hear Karen laughing outside. But that was fine. Let her think she was winning, because tomorrow, everything was going to change. Randall had dealt with his fair share of difficult customers, shady business partners, and entitled individuals who thought they could get their way by making enough noise. But Karen was on a whole different level. She wasn't just a nuisance, she was relentless, manipulative, and dangerous in a way that made it clear she had done things like this before. She wasn't just acting out in the heat of the moment, she was planning every step, making sure to push Randall into a corner where he either had to give in or fight back. And the worst part? She wasn't wrong about one thing: she knew exactly how to play the system. After the vandalism incident, Randall took the footage to the police again, expecting that, at the very least, Karen would be facing some real consequences. But when he sat down with the officer handling his case, he could already tell how this was going to go. The officer sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he leaned back in his chair. Yeah, it's her again, he muttered under his breath before shaking his head and looking back at Randall. Look, I get it, I really do. But I have to be honest with you, this is a misdemeanor. A fine at most, maybe some probation if she actually gets charged, but I wouldn't count on much. Randall clenched his jaw, keeping his frustration in check. So what am I supposed to do? Just let her keep getting away with this? The officer sighed again, clearly tired of the whole situation. You can file a restraining order, but let me tell you something: people like her. They don't care about restraining orders. You think a piece of paper is going to stop her? If anything, it'll just piss her off more. Randall leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply as he ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't surprised, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. Karen knew exactly how far she could push things without facing real consequences, and that meant she wasn't going to stop. If anything, she was going to escalate even further, knowing that Randall had already tried and failed to hold her accountable. He thanked the officer, took his copy of the report, and left, but he knew he had to start thinking differently. When he got back to the shop, he checked the security footage again, watching Karen's smug expression as she defaced his truck. The way she had practically dared him to do something about it. He had enough evidence to prove she was harassing him, but that wasn't going to be enough. He needed to change his approach. Karen wasn't scared of getting caught, she was scared of losing control. That night, Randall made some calls. He wasn't going to rely on the police anymore. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he was going to make sure she had nowhere left to run. The next morning, he showed up at work as usual, acting as if nothing had changed. He went about his business, repaired a few cars, and made sure to keep things looking normal. Karen, of course, wasn't far. She showed up around noon, standing across the street with that same smirk on her face, watching him as if she was waiting for him to react. He didn't. He acted as if he hadn't even seen her, which clearly frustrated her, because within an hour she was at his door again. "Oh, Randall," she said in that sickly sweet voice she used when she was pretending to be reasonable. "I just wanted to check in, see how you were doing. I know things have been a little tense lately, but I was thinking maybe we could come to an understanding." Randall didn't look up from the paperwork he was filling out. I don't negotiate with people who vandalize my property. Karen let out a dramatic sigh, stepping closer. Oh, don't be like that. You're making this so much harder than it needs to be. Randall finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. Harder for who? Karen smiled, but there was something sharp in her eyes. For both of us. You don't want things to get ugly, do you? Randall tilted his head slightly. Are you threatening me, Karen? Her smile didn't waver. Of course not. I'm just saying it's in everyone's best interest to settle things peacefully. I mean, think about it. You keep pushing this, and suddenly things start going wrong. Customers start getting weird emails. Maybe people start questioning how you run your business. It'd be such a shame. Randall stared at her for a long moment, then set his pen down and leaned forward slightly. You know what's funny, Karen? She raised an eyebrow. What's that? I did some digging last night, he said, his voice calm, almost casual. Turns out this isn't the first time you've pulled something like this. Karen's expression didn't change, but Randall could see the slight tension in her jaw. You tried this same routine on a guy in another town a couple of years ago, he continued. A mechanic, just like me. You faked a deal, sabotaged his shop, dragged him through hell, until he finally paid you just to make you go away. Funny thing, though, he didn't have the resources to fight back. I do. Karen's smile finally faltered. I don't know what you're talking about. Randall shrugged. That's fine. You'll figure it out soon enough. Karen hesitated for the first time, shifting her weight slightly. You can't prove anything, she said, but there was a sliver of uncertainty in her voice now. Randall didn't respond. He just leaned back in his chair and watched her. Karen huffed, turning on her heel and walking out, but Randall knew this wasn't over. If anything, he had just made her panic, and that meant she was going to make mistakes. He had already spoken to the mechanic she had scammed before, and while the guy had been hesitant at first, Randall had convinced him to go on record. He had the beginnings of a real case now, and Karen had no idea just how deep she was in. That night, he got another notification from his security system. When he checked the cameras, he saw Karen outside again, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in a dark hoodie was with her, standing near the edge of the shop's lot. They were talking, gesturing toward the building, and Randall felt his stomach tighten. She was getting desperate, and desperate people did stupid things. Randall wasn't going to wait for her to make the next move. He grabbed his phone and made another call. It was time to end this. Randall had spent his entire career dealing with problems the same way, by staying calm, thinking ahead, and making sure that when something went wrong, he had a plan. That's what had kept his business running smoothly for years, what had made him successful when so many others had failed. He wasn't the kind of man who panicked or lashed out, and he sure as hell wasn't the kind of man who let people walk all over him. But Karen wasn't just a problem, she was a goddamn hurricane, tearing through everything in her path without a second thought, convinced that if she kept pushing hard enough, the world would bend to her will. Randall had already decided he wasn't going to be one of the people who gave in. The night after she was caught outside his shop with the man in the hoodie, Randall stayed late, watching the security footage over and over again. He had called the police, filed yet another report, but he knew by now how that was going to go. Unless Karen or her little accomplice actually did something that resulted in immediate, undeniable damage, law enforcement wasn't going to lift a finger. He could already hear the tired voice of the officer telling him the same thing he had been told before, that they couldn't do much. Unless she committed a serious crime. So Randall did what he always did. He started thinking ahead. The next morning, he arrived at the shop an hour earlier than usual. He didn't open right away. Instead, he took the time to go over his records, double-checking everything from past invoices to upcoming vehicle sales. He wasn't just looking for security flaws, he was making sure that if Karen tried to pull anything else, he would be ready. He had already secured statements from the other mechanics she had targeted before, but now he needed to make sure that every part of his own operation was airtight. He was halfway through reviewing some paperwork when his phone buzzed. It was his bank. Mr. Holt, the voice on the other end said. We wanted to confirm a flagged transaction request on your business account. Randall's stomach tightened. What request? There was a brief pause. A withdrawal request of $5,000 was initiated this morning under your business account. The system flagged it due to a discrepancy in the signature. Did you authorize this transaction? Randall gripped the edge of his desk. No, I didn't. Another pause. Then, we suspected as much. We've placed a hold on the request, but we strongly recommend you come in and verify your account security. Randall barely heard the rest of what the banker was saying. His mind was already working through the possibilities, but he didn't need much time to figure it out. Karen had tried to steal from him. Somehow, she had gotten hold of enough information to fake a withdrawal attempt. He ended the call, grabbed his keys, and locked up the shop. He drove straight to the bank, where the manager met him personally and walked him through the attempted fraud. Someone had used a forged signature, but they had also attempted to present a fake business authorization form 1 that supposedly listed an additional authorized party for financial decisions related to the shop. The name on the form? Karen Bishop. Randall stared at the paperwork, his pulse steady but his thoughts racing. She was getting bolder, more reckless, and more desperate. This isn't the first time she's tried something like this, Randall muttered. The bank manager looked at him carefully. You know this person? Randall exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay composed. Yeah, I do. And she's not going to stop. The bank immediately shut down any further transactions related to Karen's fraudulent form, and Randall took every precaution necessary to ensure she wouldn't be able to pull something like this again. But the whole thing left a sour taste in his mouth. She had been willing to commit financial fraud just to make his life harder. That meant she was reaching the point where she wasn't even thinking about consequences anymore. And people who stopped thinking about consequences, they were dangerous. Randall had barely made it back to the shop when the next disaster hit. A customer was waiting for him in the parking lot, arms crossed, looking furious. The moment Randall stepped out of his truck, the man stormed toward him. What kind of scam are you running here? Randall tensed. Excuse me? The man shoved a folder at him. Randall took it, flipping it open. His stomach twisted as he saw what was inside. It was a printed email, one that looked like it had come from his shop. The message claimed that Randall had taken a deposit on a car that wasn't actually available, and that if the customer wanted their money back, they'd have to pay a cancellation fee. Randall's jaw tightened. I didn't send this. The man scoffed. Oh yeah? Then why is it signed with your name? Randall clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He had seen this tactic before. Karen was trying to turn his own customers against him. She had already tried messing with his finances, and now she was going after his reputation. Look, Randall said carefully, keeping his voice even, I don't know where you got this email from, but I can promise you it didn't come from me. Give me 5 minutes, and I'll prove it. The man hesitated, clearly still angry but also willing to listen. Randall motioned for him to follow him inside. He pulled up his actual business email account, scrolled through the sent messages, and showed the man that no such email had ever been sent from his shop. Then he pointed out the small discrepancies in the fake email's subtle changes in the logo placement, the slight difference in font size. The customer frowned, looking from the email to Randall, and then exhaled sharply. So someone's trying to screw you over? Looks like it, Randall said grimly. The man sighed. Damn, I guess I jumped to conclusions. Sorry about that. Randall shook his head. I get it. Someone's trying to make me look bad. Just do me a favor, if you get anything else weird like this, let me know. The customer nodded and left, and Randall leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Karen was escalating. She had already tried vandalizing his shop, harassing him in person, screwing with his business, and now outright fraud. She was running out of tricks, but that didn't mean she was going to stop. If anything, it meant she was about to do something even worse. And Randall had the sinking feeling that whatever came next was going to be the worst thing yet. Randall had spent weeks dealing with Karen's relentless harassment, her vandalism, her attempts at financial fraud, and now her direct attack on his business. He had tried handling things the right way, filing reports, gathering evidence, making sure he had everything documented. But no matter how much he did, she kept escalating, pushing further, making it clear that she wasn't going to stop until she either got what she wanted or ruined him completely. He had already prepared himself for whatever she would do next, but when it finally happened, even he wasn't expecting just how far she would go. It was late in the evening when the call came in. Randall had been finishing up some paperwork, trying to clear his mind after another exhausting day of dealing with the fallout from Karen's latest stunt. His phone buzzed on the desk, and when he picked it up, his stomach immediately tensed. It was the police. "Mr. Holt?" The voice on the other end said, "We need you to come down to the station." Randall's grip tightened on the phone. "What's going on?" There was a brief hesitation. "We have a report against you. It would be best if you came in and gave your side of the story." Randall knew exactly who had filed the report before the officer even said another word. He didn't ask any more questions. He just grabbed his keys, locked up the shop, and headed straight for the station. When he arrived, it was worse than he expected. Karen was already there, sitting in the waiting area with a smug, satisfied look on her face, dabbing fake tears from her eyes with a tissue as she whispered something to the officer next to her. The moment she saw Randall, her expression flickered just for a second into something closer to amusement. She had set a trap, and she thought he had walked right into it. The officer gestured for Randall to follow him into a small interview room, and once the door was closed, he sat down across from him with a folder in his hands. "Mr. Holt," he began, his tone careful, measured. "We received a report from Ms. Bishop earlier this evening. She's claiming that you sold her a defective vehicle which resulted in an accident. She's also alleging that when she confronted you about it, you threatened her safety." Randall stared at him, barely able to believe what he was hearing. "You're kidding." "My." The officer didn't react. "Do you have any response to these claims?" Randall exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. "I never sold her a car. That's the first lie. The second? I never threatened her. If anything, she's the one who's been harassing me for weeks. I have security footage, bank records, and witness statements to prove that she's been targeting me, not the other way around." The officer leaned back slightly. "You have evidence?" Randall nodded. "Plenty of it." The officer studied him for a long moment, then pushed the folder across the table. "Here's where things get complicated. Miss Bishop provided a bill of sale with your signature on it, stating that you transferred ownership of a vehicle to her. She also provided a written statement from someone claiming to be a witness, saying they overheard you threatening her at your shop." Randall clenched his jaw. She had forged a bill of sale. That was her big move. And worse, she had roped someone else into backing up her lies. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "I can prove that document is fake. My actual sales records don't show any transaction with her. If you compare signatures, I guarantee they won't match. And as for this so-called witness, I'd like to know who they are. Because I have security footage from my shop proving that she was never inside to confront me." The officer considered this, then slowly nodded. "All right, let's take a look at what you've got." Randall handed over everything: copies of his emails proving she had been impersonating him to his customers, footage of her vandalizing his truck, records from the bank confirming her attempted fraud, and screenshots of every police report he had filed against her. By the time he was finished, the officer's expression had shifted completely. "This is a lot," the officer admitted, flipping through the documents. "And it paints a very different picture than the one she gave us." Randall leaned forward slightly. "You think?" The officer exhaled through his nose, setting the folder aside. All right, here's what's going to happen. We're going to bring her back in, ask her a few follow-up questions, and see how she reacts. If what you're saying checks out, and from the looks of it, it does, then she just made a serious mistake by filing a false police report. Randall didn't say anything. He just sat back and waited. Less than 15 minutes later, he heard shouting from down the hall. Karen's voice, shrill and indignant, demanding to know why she was being questioned again. Then the sound of another officer's calm, measured response. Then silence. Another 20 minutes passed before the officer returned, shaking his head. "She's not handling this well," he said. The moment we started pressing her on inconsistencies in her story, she started backtracking. We also took a closer look at that bill of sale she provided. Turns out it wasn't just a forgery. It was an incredibly bad forgery. Randall crossed his arms. "So what happens now?" The officer sighed. "She's being charged with filing a false police report, attempted fraud, and harassment. Given everything you provided, there's a strong case against her. She won't be walking away from this one." Randall felt the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. He hadn't won yet, but at least for the first time since this nightmare started, it felt like Karen was finally facing consequences. "She'll probably try to fight it," the officer continued. "She's the type who thinks she's untouchable. But with this much evidence against her, it's not looking good for her." Randall exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Good." The officer nodded. "We'll keep you updated on what happens next. In the meantime, if she tries anything else, let us know immediately." Randall stood, shaking the officer's hand before heading for the exit. As he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax. Karen had finally gone too far, and now she was the one backed into a corner. Randall had spent weeks dealing with Karen's relentless harassment, her vandalism, her fraud, and her complete disregard for consequences. He had watched as she escalated from petty intimidation to full-blown criminal behavior, all because she couldn't handle being told no. And now, finally, she was sitting in a jail cell, waiting for her lawyer to scrape together whatever defense they could come up with. Randall knew better than to think this was over. People like Karen didn't just accept defeat, they thrashed, they lied, they tried to twist reality into something that suited their version of events. But for the first time since this nightmare started, she was no longer in control. The next morning, Randall arrived at his shop to find things strangely quiet. No slashed tires, no spray-painted insults on his truck, no passive-aggressive notes taped to his door. It was almost unsettling. He had gotten so used to looking over his shoulder that the sudden absence of Karen's presence felt unnatural. But the damage she had done wouldn't just disappear overnight. She had left a trail of destruction behind her financially, professionally, and personally. By midday, his phone rang. It was the officer from the night before. "Just wanted to update you," the officer said. "Karen's lawyer is already talking about a plea deal. Seems like she's realizing she's not as invincible as she thought." Randall leaned back in his chair, processing the words. "So what's on the table?" "She's trying to negotiate a deal where she pleads guilty to some of the lesser charges in exchange for dropping the more serious ones. Right now, that means admitting to the false police report and fraud, but trying to downplay the harassment and vandalism." Randall let out a slow breath. "And what happens if the deal goes through?" "She'd probably get probation, a fine, maybe some mandatory community service," the officer admitted. "But here's the thing, you have a say in this. If you want to push for the full extent of the charges, you can." Randall was silent for a moment, considering. He had spent weeks dealing with this woman, tearing his life apart for no reason other than her own entitlement. Letting her off easy didn't sit right with him. But at the same time, he wasn't a vindictive man. He didn't need to see her rot in a jail cell, he just needed her gone. "I want it on record that I don't accept her version of events," he said finally. "If she's taking a plea deal, I want a restraining order included. I don't want her anywhere near my business or my home ever again." The officer made a note of it. That's reasonable. I'll make sure it's part of the conditions. Randall hung up and exhaled slowly. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Over the next few days, word of what had happened started spreading through the neighborhood. People who had once turned a blind eye to Karen's behavior were suddenly very eager to distance themselves from her. The same neighbors who had politely tolerated her manipulations were now whispering behind closed doors about how they had always suspected she was trouble. Randall didn't care much for gossip, but he found it satisfying in a quiet way to watch Karen's social standing crumble as fast as her legal defense. Then, just when he thought things were finally settling down, a familiar car pulled into his lot. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows. Randall sighed, already knowing who it was before the driver's door even opened. Karen's lawyer stepped out, adjusting his expensive suit with a practiced air of authority. He walked toward the shop with a smooth, calculated stride, the kind that came from years of negotiating deals in boardrooms where the stakes were measured in dollar signs. Randall met him at the door, arms crossed. "If you're here to plead her case, save your breath." The lawyer gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just here to tie up loose ends. Ms. Bishop has agreed to the plea deal. She'll be serving probation, paying damages, and staying far away from you. You won." Randall didn't react. "Then why are you here?" The lawyer tilted his head slightly. "Off the record?" She's furious. She thought she'd walk away from this without any real consequences. She still doesn't believe she did anything wrong. Randall wasn't surprised. Karen had spent her entire life getting away with things because people let her. She had manipulated, intimidated, and lied her way through every situation, always assuming she'd come out on top. But this time she had pushed the wrong person. "I don't care how she feels," Randall said evenly. "As long as she stays out of my life." The lawyer nodded. "She will. She doesn't have a choice." With that, he turned and walked back to his car. Randall watched him drive away, then exhaled. That evening, for the first time in what felt like forever, he locked up the shop without checking the security cameras 3 times. He sat on his porch with a cold beer in hand, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. He had spent weeks fighting against someone who thought she could take whatever she wanted without consequences, and now she was finally gone. As he stared out into the night, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace.